I don't want to change the nomenclature surrounding feminism, but I do want to introduce an idea of pre-feminism, of a precursor to feminism. Really, the idea that when we talk about first-wave feminism, we're talking about women who strive to give other women the right to vote, or even men who strive to give women the right to vote. And this was something that started to pick up steam with the suffragette movement, 1880s, started to actually be enacted into law in 1910, 1920. So that political movement, I would have to argue, is the result of previous, sometimes people call these meta-political factors. And these are cultural factors, these are religious factors, in some cases even economic factors. But I need some kind of word, the antecedent to feminism, or feminism 0.5 or something like that. That when you have the Protestant Reformation, you have to understand traditionally the Catholic Church castrated young boys because they needed singers with a high voice, and women couldn't sing in the church. It's not something people remember. It's not something people really talk about. But people took seriously in a spiritual way, not just in a pragmatic way, but in a spiritual way, the idea that women shouldn't speak in church. Women should have no active power in church. Within the religious sphere, they should be totally passive, totally receiving. And that includes in singing, which was a very important spiritual act. So, with the coming of Protestantism, the relationship between the church and women, it opens to chaotic elements. There's a lot of change, there's a lot of experimentation, a lot of different sects of Christianity. And for the first time in a while, there's this opening for women to have a more active role. And the first female prophetesses that you see, for instance in England, which is a huge hotbed for experimentation owing to the dual nature of its culture. You have a Norman aristocracy, you have an Anglo-Saxon middle class and lower class, and then of course Cromwell brings in Jews as a separate class to these other classes, as specifically a moneylender class. So there are these different dynamics going on in England that makes it very different from even France, which had a Protestant and Catholic divide, or Germany had a similar divide. Even Poland at one point was looking to be a Protestant country, and then there was a counter-reformation in Poland that won it back to Catholicism. So we can look at all sorts of different countries in Europe, but particularly England, for several reasons, including the fact that Britain, or the British Crown, has for a while now owned multiple nations. And so implicitly there, like the concept of nationalism, and when we talk about identity, I think, race and gender there is an intersectional component, where if you live in a nation or you live in a country which is just one nation, I think that does lend itself to, the homogeneity, even though you could argue something like Sweden, this hasn't been the case. But I just think that there's something more anti-traditional about English history, and the fact that you have so many different influences from so many different cultures and so many things to pick from and choose from. And that's very particular to the English experience, as opposed to even just on a linguistic level, I think is the place where it's most clear compared to France or Germany or wherever. Moving on, you had English prophetesses who would say that I'm not speaking on my own, because women shouldn't be allowed to speak in church, women shouldn't be allowed to speak on religious matters. Rather, God is speaking through me. And so when I speak and I make these prophecies, don't listen to me, listen to God who speaks through me. And that was kind of the excuse that they were making. It was a very early point in what I would call proto-feminism, probably the best word. Don't know why I didn't think of it before. But this proto-feminism guised itself in the language of patriarchy. In the same way that you look, I think it's Queen Elizabeth when she gives her speech rallying the troops against the Spanish Armada, she says, my body is weak and I'm just a mere woman, but, God in the nation empowers me to have the heart of a man, and I, implore you to fight for England. So in these cases, we see women who are masking this kind of proto-feminism in the language of patriarchy. And this is something that feminists recognize in their own lineage. So when they go back in history, and they're constantly trying to do this retcon where... But, that's an interesting question. Is it really a retcon? Is it really a retcon? Is the left really just making things up? Because you have to wonder, when you have some kind of social movement or idea that is completely contrary or completely opposite to another idea, and you see a transition period between one to the next, you have to ask yourself, do these things just pop out of nowhere? Or is there a very long progression to things? It's an interesting question. And it's an interesting question to ask if there's always the perennial potential for these kinds of things. And if we can look in history, are there times in history where we can talk about feminism historically? It's a question of do you see, and this is kind of the conservative right-wing view, is that all of history is just one value system. And this was kind of, Julius Evola, he has that quote, "I simply believe what everyone else believed before the French Revolution. All my ideas were normal ideas before the French Revolution." So it's this idea that ranging from ancient pagan times to early Christian times to medieval times to the Renaissance and everything up to, and for some, it depends how someone defines himself as a conservative or traditionalist or whatever. But you have some people who say, from ancient times, from the caveman up through 1950, we didn't have feminism, we had a patriarchy. And all of a sudden now there's this feminism which is completely novel, it's completely new, it just came out of nowhere, and we just have this blip of feminism. And sometimes people on the left view it this way as well. They say everything prior to 1950 is toxic and worthless, and everything after the 1960s, that's the only time we get anything good at all. And, which is a very strange worldview to me, the idea that somehow human nature and human ideology and human thought was completely stagnant on certain issues such as gender. That everyone was patriarchal from the beginning of time until the 1960s, and then all of a sudden this huge titanic shifting of the polar ice caps happened. I think that's a naive view of the world. I think that, again, it's a very, it's a teleological view of the world. In some ways, it's a Christian or a Jewish view of the world, where you have these certain, periods of time, certain ages of history, and then all of a sudden, at the end, there comes this. Either if you're talking about Armageddon, if you're talking about the rule of the Antichrist, or you're talking about the coming of the Messiah, whatever, there's this final age which is just completely distinct from the previous ages. So in some senses, I think that's naive when we're talking about human psychology. I think there is an element of feminism that we can find in history, or proto-feminism, and we can look at that and we can see how it rises and falls given certain conditions, and then we can see how technology and various factors enable this proto-feminism to then become an explicit feminism. It's no longer operating within the rules of patriarchy, but it's creating its own rules. So again, you have a proto-feminism which starts off, in my opinion, very religious. And then I think it moves into the cultural sphere. And again, this is something that I think that the potential for feminism is always there, in the same way that the potential for obesity is always there. So if you take a caveman and you feed him Diet Coke, like if we resurrected the Neanderthal and fed him Diet Coke, we could probably make an obese Neanderthal, even though if you actually look at the skeletal structure and everything, these were robust, very fit hominids, or people, or however you want to describe them. But you could make cavemen fat and obese. Now, on average, were cavemen fat and obese? No, not at all. Very few were, if any. Because, when we talk about cavemen, of course, I'm just speaking about Paleolithic peoples and not literally talking about peoples who live exclusively in caves, and these people are nomadic peoples. They're hunters, they're gatherers, and so they would go to an area, exploit the resources, and then move on to the next resource-rich area after that area became depleted. And this process of moving around all the time required you to be pretty fit, because there would be periods of fasting and there would be periods of feasting. And there would be periods where you would just be on the move for quite a while. And there would be periods where food wasn't available. So this process of bulking and cutting, as we refer it now, that produced a lot of very fit people. I mean, human beings are meant to be fit. That's why we're attracted to, athletic people, is because that's sort of the natural human form. So, I don't even know how I got on that topic. We're talking about proto-feminism. We're talking about these cultural trends. So obesity is something, the potential for obesity has always existed. But there's a difference between obesity as a social movement or a social trend and obesity as something isolated or obesity as something cyclical. And so basically what I want to say here is that the potential for feminism, the desire of women to have power in society, has always been there. And we can talk about instances of matriarchal societies, especially outside the Eurocentric context. We can look at different cultures and say, okay, well, there's this random tribe in the Himalayas or the Amazon or something, and they have this matriarchal society. So I think in human psychology there is this potential for feminism that's always there, and sometimes it's expressed and sometimes it's not. In the same way we have a potential for obesity, sometimes it's expressed, sometimes it's not. So I want to look at feminism as sort of a perennial factor of human relationships, or proto-feminism, or a kind of underlying feminism, and I think Camille Paglia addresses this quite nicely in her book Sexual Personae, the way that she describes historical trends and the way she describes the dynamic between women and men, and that women are solipsistic. This is according to Paglia. Women, the female in herself is solipsistic. The female in herself has an element of sadism, something that doesn't often come to the fore. And civilization says, whoa, we need to curb that. We need to control that energy. We need to stifle that. We need to put women in order, because otherwise we're going to have this Chthonian chaos of nature. When you see a woman who is defending her child, there are all kinds of videos on the YouTubes, on the internet, where you can find women who feel that their child is being endangered or threatened, and they just come out like wild animals. And people from all different backgrounds, some backgrounds more than others, but in any case, you can see that there's a vicious element to the female, there's a power-hungry element to the female, and that civilization traditionally has controlled that because it's been viewed as a consumptive element, and I would say as a capitalist element, that women are always focused on consuming resources, men are more focused on conserving resources, producing resources. So with that dynamic in mind, there's always this hidden underbelly, this Lovecraftian, Chthonian, proto-feminism under the skin of civilization, under the veneer. And Paglia talks about, and it's sort of a Freudian analysis, the relationship between mothers and sons, and the power dynamics there that go on. And she talks about how on one level, men in a patriarchal society are dominant, but on the other hand, they're always trying to impress women, and in a sense that is subservient, in a sense that is, serving the woman, which is why traditionally priests are meant to be celibate in a lot of cases. Priests are meant to be separate from women, because to be a man who is seeking after women is to be a man who is in some ways subservient to the whims of women, because he's trying to impress them, and so he has to somehow take on an element of their psychology or be subservient, follow the rules of the game, and the rules are defined by women in that case, what they like, not what is good in the truest sense. So I just think that this feminism has always existed in a deep level as a potentiality. Now, because of something like the Protestant Reformation, which opens up, basically opens up the field for all kinds of new, unheard of ideas, people become accepting, people become tolerant, I mean, just because of the nature of warfare between Protestants and Catholics, at some point people are like, look, for the sake of capitalism, for the sake of stability, for the sake of preserving our lives over preserving what is good and true, over preserving our honor, we need to come up with an idea of tolerance and sovereignty. And I think this tolerance and sovereignty is what allows a potentiality like feminism to come into actuality, first in religious spheres, and secondly in cultural spheres, literary spheres, artistic spheres, women as poets, women as writers. And so I think that's kind of the second stage of this expression of feminism, this historical continuity. So we have the proto-feminism in religion, proto-feminism in art, culture, music, theater, drama. Is another thing. Shakespeare was meant to be performed by all men. If you ever take a class on Shakespeare, they'll tell you, well, yeah, there are female characters, but those were just men who would shave their beards, put on a wig, and speak in a very high voice. So that was the norm in Shakespearean England, that it would be so taboo for a woman to act in the theater. I mean, she would be lower than a prostitute at that point. It was just seen as totally socially unacceptable. Same way women couldn't sing in the church. And so at that point, you had then a shifting when women were allowed into theater, women were allowed into drama, women were allowed to be singers. Now today we think of a female singer. When I say the word singer to you, you might think of a man, but oftentimes we think of a woman. And that singing is a profession of women. We think, who do you think is a better singers on the whole? Do you know more good female singers or more good male singers? And I think it is a trait of women that women like to sing, and women do like to sing along to songs in a way that men don't feel the same need. I think understanding that psychology of music and why exactly that is probably another topic. But in any case, the introduction of women into music, the introduction of women as opera singers, okay, that was a cultural revolution, something that went on very, very different from what had happened before. Now, if you look at ancient Greece and Rome, there were women in drama. They were considered to be like prostitutes. So this is not the pendulum swinging between patriarchy and feminism here does not mean that when we talk about like what's normal, natural, healthy for a civilization, that's kind of dependent on the context of that civilization. And is it based in organic traditions, or is it based in biblical axioms? There's a differentiation there that has to be made. But when you have a culture that derives its morality from biblical axioms, at least explicitly, implicitly there could be some kind of pagan tradition going on, but explicitly there's biblical axioms. Once you start breaking those biblical axioms, you've set up a situation for hypocrisy, and you've set up a situation where people just want to throw the whole thing out and turn everything over and invert the whole system. So that's a very difficult position to be in when you have this book and you say this book is axiomatically true, and you start contradicting the things in the book. Then you're liable to throw the whole thing out, which is what a lot of young people do even today when they become atheists. They say, well, this part of the Bible's wrong, therefore it cannot be axiomatically true, and therefore let's throw the whole thing out. Now, from like an organic moral perspective, where morality is sort of context dependent and it evolves from traditions over time, in the same way that it's basically a mimetic view of morality, that in the same way that we evolve biologically over time to become more beautiful, more fit, more creative, what have you, at the same time the mimetics of morality evolves over time. And so if one thing is wrong, that's okay. We don't have to throw out the whole system. In the same way that, like, if I evolve to lose my toenails, that's okay. I'm still viable as an organism. I don't think that the toenails really serve a purpose except being sort of aesthetic in a kind of a way. They're sort of decorative, maybe. And it's normal to see people with toenails. If I saw someone without toenails, I would be, I don't even know what that looks like. I'm sure you could find some pictures on the internet, but I don't care to look that up right now. The point I'm trying to make is that basically there's the religious, the cultural, and then finally we get the first wave feminism, right? So the first wave of feminism is the political. But what I'm trying to say here is that there is a deep progression, in the same way that anything, we talk about nationalism, we talk about masonry, we talk about capitalism, we talk about social trends. I see these as very long trends having histories of hundreds of years prior to their actual expression. When an idea becomes expressed, when an idea becomes actually dominant in society, then that, to me, I always say, what are the roots of that? That the ascension to power, the taking of power, the conquering of society, that is the tip of the iceberg. I ask, what's the 90% of the iceberg which is submerged in history? So we look at something like communism. I don't think communism was just conceived by Marx and then implemented in, the 1920s. I don't think the history of communism is that short. I think the genesis of Marx's explicit communism comes from a long history of more implicit communism, in that there are precursors to communism. We can say the same thing about feminism. And all these ideas are sort of interlocked and intertwined, but it's useful sometimes just to isolate one idea and one dynamic, in this case the role of women to men, and just look at that, because then it's a clearer picture. You can have sort of a neater narrative, because when you have intertwining ideas, interlocking ideas, they might be progressing at different rates, and it's not as easy to form a narrative. When we talk about first wave feminism, we're talking about women who said, all right, women can have a role in the church, they can have a role in culture, and now they can have a role in politics. However, women don't need to be equal economically, they don't need to be equal sexually. So that was first wave feminism. And basically, if you look at this, I'm saying that first wave feminism is a consequence of earlier forms of proto-feminism. Because you had the relationship between men and women was explicitly defined by the Bible. As soon as you start contradicting the Bible, you lose your grounds for a morality of gender relations. And so what I'm arguing is that you should have an organic, or a rationalist, or a psychoanalytic view of gender relations, where you look at from the ground up, okay, yes, women want feminism, but is that good for them? In the same way, yes, I want to drink a Diet Coke every hour on the hour, but is that good for me? Like, I want it in the moment, but am I going to live a happier life as an obese sluggard, or am I going to live a happier life being lean and healthy? It's an important question. So when we look at feminism, is feminism something that is going to satisfy immediate urges, but in the long term be bad, or is feminism something that's actually good? That's the important question here that we can answer, and we don't even need to technically reference tradition. Technically, it's an empirical question. Now, empirically, it's a difficult question to answer, because we're not just asking what's good for the individual, but what's good for the society. However, I'm not even giving an answer to that question in this video prescriptively saying whether it's bad or good. I'm simply saying that we should strive to answer that question within the context of our times, because relying upon tradition, relying upon the Bible at this point seems to have been in a process of falling out. It's not that we've recently abandoned Christianity. Like, since the 1960s, we abandoned Christianity. No, that's not what happened. We've been abandoning Christianity for hundreds and hundreds of years. And this has been a slow and steady process. It's been a methodical process. And it's a logical consequence of when you take a text to be axiomatic, rather than you take it from like a traditionalist perspective, and then you start breaking the rules. Well, then it's kind of like a crumbling structure, and there is nowhere to go but down. So if you want to resurrect healthy gender relations, you kind of have to do it from principles that can be justified in the here and now, which is our current experience, our current psychology. And like, you can reference tradition, but you can't do it in an axiomatic way. So, moving on. You have the religious, cultural, political. Now, the second wave of feminism is basically the economic. it's starting to say, okay, women have the same political rights as men in terms of voting. But now women need to be part of all these careers. We need women CEOs, we need women truck drivers, we need women doing all these different things. So there's this progressive push for equal rights and equal opportunity. Finally, in the 1960s, again, people conceive of the 1950s as the height of patriarchy. It was not. It was the predecessor to the 60s. In the 60s, women were granted these equal rights. So we have political moves to economic. What's next? Economic moves to sexual. Now this is interesting because what it tells me is it tells me that religious life is sort of the weakest area of public life, and it's the one that's as an institution, religious life has been the weakest since the 1600s or prior. Then the next weakest part of our life was our cultural life, our even you could say the linguistic life, literary life, musical life. All these cultural things, they're the most public and the most subject to change. They were not the strongest institutions. So these were the ones that fell first. And then you had the political. Okay, so the political system was open for radicalization. It was open to change. And then finally the economic. So the economic, now you're getting very close to the sexual. You can sort of see this hierarchy where the religious is sort of the most public thing. And now today I believe we do have a religion, which is like anti-racism. And that is very, very, very public. The questions of are you a racist or are you not a racist is the most important question that you could ask someone because it's a religious question. It's a religious question, meaning if you answer in the affirmative, you are a demon, and if you answer no, then you're a normal person. This would be in the same place if I asked you in medieval Europe, I said, are you a Christian or are you not a Christian? That'd be the question of asking, are you a normal person or are you a demon? Are you a heretic? Do you deserve to be burned at the stake? So that's kind of the outermost level of society, and that is the most public thing, and that is something everyone needs to be lockstep with. Then you kind of move on to the politics, or, actually in between that is the culture, literary, musical, whatever. And then you get to the politics. Again, it's very public. It concerns people. Are you a Democrat or are you a Republican? And today in America, that means a huge degree because it's very similar to the question of are you racist or are you not racist? And so the two are becoming aligned in that way. Now, culture, what kind of music you like, that's changeable. I'm trying to see how the hierarchy works here because in some senses you could say that religious questions are intimate and they're personal and they're not public. That's how we conceive of them today. But I'm not sure that's actually how things progressed from religious, cultural, political, and then economic. So the idea that the economics are something very personal, something very private, is not often how we conceive of it. Often we conceive of it being the opposite, right? That first, the most private thing you would have would be sex. The second most private thing you would have would maybe be your religious convictions, or you can reverse those if you like. But first, what you do in the bedroom, what you do in the church, we shouldn't talk about that, and then political opinions, that should also be something private, and then what would be superficial, what would be on the surface, would be things like culture. That's one way of conceiving of this hierarchy of privacy, intimacy to what is public. And then how do we connect that with a hierarchy of what is stable in society, what is guarded, what is protected, what is intimate, what is within the temenos, what is behind the shroud, and then what is public, what is mutable, what is subject to change, what is not taboo, what is not sacred. So we have sacred spaces, ideological spaces that cannot be changed, and then we have open public spaces that are subject to debate. And we would think that economics would be one of those areas of society where you could say, hey, I don't care if you believe in higher taxes or lower taxes. Change it up, whatever. But actually, in a capitalist society, I would argue that economics is one of the most intimate parts of society. Whereas something like, your religion means nothing in a capitalist context. and you look back at Cromwell, right? So all these different hierarchies that I'm trying to describe, hierarchies of stability of institutions, hierarchies of intimacy and privacy, and what people believe, like what is the core of your identity versus what is extraneous and what is superficial. So people say, I don't care what kind of music you like, therefore it's superficial. But from a capitalist point of view, the most intimate thing is sex, because that's the most basic form of consumption. And that's basically what all capitalism reverts to, is sex appeal. You're always trying to sell sex in one form or another. And then beyond sex, you have economics, the economic system. That's deeply important from a capitalist worldview. And then what lies outside of that? Then you have politics. Well, politics really influence economics. So that becomes the outer layer of the economic system. So we can change. This is why in a capitalist system, you can have people who vary wildly on social issues. They can say, I hate gay people, I love gay people, whatever. But at the end of the day, they're all capitalists. So that's the neoliberal order that stretches back to people like Cromwell, who supposedly was so fanatically anti-Catholic, and yet he let the Jews back into England, who you would think, not being Christians, would be even worse than the Catholics, but that wasn't the case. Because my argument is that really the revolution, that part of the revolution Cromwell was engaging with, was a capitalist revolution. It wasn't just religious. So again, you start with sex, then you go to economics, then you go to politics as being the next sacred space, and then you get to things like culture and tastes and attitudes and music, and finally you get to religion. Religion being the least important, religion being superficial. Because capitalism is ultimately opposed to religion, therefore it wants to devalue religion. Because religion says, let's care about immaterial things, let's care about the next life, whereas capitalism says, let's care about the here and now, the desire to consume. Starting with sex, economics, politics, culture, finally religion. And so it's interesting to me to see how feminism broke down these barriers. First, proto-feminism with religion. And people often think of that as the opposite, that, oh, well, the Catholic priests are still male. But I'm kind of looking at it from a Protestant-centered historical context, which if you look at the history of feminism, political feminism first came in Lutheran parts of America, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and so on. These were the socialist feminist parts of America at that time. Interesting to think about in today's political context. But still, there's a specific context I'm talking about here. And you see how these barriers and borders are knocked down. First the religious, then the cultural, literary, and then we have as well the political, and then we have the economic. And then finally it comes to the sexual. And now we're talking about the second wave feminism, basically. First wave feminism being political. Did I say second wave feminism being economic? Well, the economics is still a contentious issue today with the wage gap. But, that comes at, it's really, I think, the official standardized, because it's, now that I'm adding in these proto-feminisms, it becomes even difficult to refer back to the mainstream categorization of feminist waves. But first wave being the political, second wave perhaps being the anti-porn feminists. That you first have feminists who say we should have the right to vote and everything else should stay the same. Second wave feminists who say we should then have sexual rights in terms of not being exploited sexually in the bedroom, not being exploited by pornography. So they were against violence, and they were for lesbianism. And they were, basically, it moved from give women the right to vote to we hate men. Now, there were progressions in between that, and there was talk of economic feminism, and there were all kinds of things going on there. But second wave feminism is where people started to get scared. And people started to get like, whoa, this is out of control, we can't handle this. Because it started to interfere with people's sex lives. And it started to impact people on that most fundamental, basic level of capitalism, and also human nature and psychology. Freud and Keynes are in confluence here. Marx, perhaps, that sex is this most basic part of human psychology and of life from this capitalist perspective. So, it starts to impact people in a big way, and this is when you start to get pushback or writing against feminism, and then the church starts to say, whoa, we need to stop this feminism thing. And conservative evangelical Christians, but what they don't realize is, you know, women have been singing in the church, and that was one of the first pillars to go. So there's a lot of contradictions here in how people view feminism today as, oh, the church is the last bastion against feminism. Which, if you look at the Catholic Church, they've embraced a lot of things that traditionally the church hadn't embraced. They've embraced Jewish people, they've embraced anti-racism, they've embraced economic leftism, they've embraced all these kinds of things, but they have not embraced female priests. So that's kind of the last thing to fall. And who knows if that'll ever happen. But that's how people view the church today. But again, historically, I think it's kind of been the opposite. So people start to write these anti-feminist tracts. I mean, people, when it was just talking about giving the women the right to vote, no one was really that mad. No one was really writing parodies or satires to the extent that you see after the 1960s, especially the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. You have people like Chuck Palahniuk, writer of Fight Club, and he starts writing about the crisis of masculinity. But this is a tradition through the 70s of people saying like, hey, the way that you have all these man haters. I think whoever the guy was who did the he did like the chicken noodle soup cans, and I'm trying to think of it was like chicken soup cans artist Andy Warhol. See, I got that even before it came up. Andy Warhol, and I want to know who was the woman who tried to kill him. It was like Valerie Jean Solanas. This is in 1968. So, Andy Warhol was the, he was a leftist, right? But Valerie Solanas comes along, and people see this, and they don't like it. They don't like this kind of feminism. And so there is a kind of, at this point, there is, for the first time, an anti-feminist movement. In a way that hadn't been seen before. I mean, there was opposition to the suffragettes and everything, but there's a new tenor to it, where people are finally if you look at this religious, cultural, political, and then finally we're coming to sex. If you look at these different spheres of society, from my perspective, feminism conquered everything. And then we finally came to the point where in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, men started to realize early on, they said, hey, look, feminism has won. Men are actually diminutive now. Now, this is following Polya's analysis that basically women, according to nature, are the masters. That women hold the sexual power. They define what is sexually attractive, what is not sexually attractive. And so men are trying to appeal to their interests. Woman, as the mother, has this kind of cosmic power, and from the point of view of children, their parents are like gods, and so this influences the male psychology. And so basically, if we don't restrain women according to civilizing forces, that they can be like harpies, they can be like Medusa, they can be these terrifying Chthonian creatures, that like the Furies, or trying to think of Greek. Let's search Greek women tear apart or something like that. The Maenads, yes, the Maenads, the followers of Dionysus, and they would rip apart a man. Was sparagmos is the tearing apart, that they would tear apart these animals and eat them raw. I mean, what's the old adage? Hell hath no fury like a woman. I mean, women's anger, it's a very bestial, animalistic, abusive, sadistic kind of a thing. So you have to contain this. And there comes a point in the 60s, 70s, 80s that early men's rights activists, they start to recognize that, wow, women actually control everything. I mean, there was a time when women controlled the underbelly of men's psychology, and now they're just dominating everything explicitly. So they dominate all these different fields of life. And there's nothing we can do. Traditionally, if a woman used psychological warfare against a man and said, you're worthless and you're nothing, women will do this. And they will destroy a man's psychology. They will destroy his self-worth. And the only real defense that a man has is that he's more physically powerful and he can control society using his intellect. And so he can institute rules and norms that put women in check. But progressively over time, I mean, prohibition, here's another one. Prohibition was an element of the feminist movement. It was trying to stop men from coming home and being drunk and beating their wives. So there are all these elements here that add up finally to when you get in the 80s, there are a lot of men who are like, hey, you know, this feminism thing has gone too far, it's out of control. And women actually are starting to have all the power. And this progresses now, you have the third wave feminists. And again, there's a lot more waves here than people recognize. There's a lot more iterations and steps in this process than 1, 2, 3. It's proto-feminism religious, proto-feminism cultural, political wave, prohibition wave, trying to control drugs and alcohol, and then you have the sexual revolution, and at the same time, so sexual revolution is about the liberation of sexuality. Anyone can have sex with anyone, no one's a slut, but at the same time along that saying male sexuality is evil, male sexuality needs to be controlled, we need to stop rape culture, we're anti-pornographic activists. So there are those two currents going on in the 60s. They're kind of in tension, battling with one another, contradictory. And finally, you have the third wave feminism that just says, hey, sex for everybody, respect consent. So there's this kind of fusion of the two trends. On the one hand, the men are evil, which is a school of feminism. And on the other hand, have as much sex as possible is the other school of feminism. So these two are kind of combined into this consent culture where you can do anything you want as long as the woman consents, and that's the really important thing. Male consent is never talked about. Male consent is never an issue. You will never see propaganda. You'll see tons of propaganda given to people about how men are rapists, men are denying female consent. You'll never see in culture, art, music, film, whatever, you're never going to see a man denying consent to a woman. That's just not part of the equation. So when we talk about consent, we're always talking about giving power to women. Never talking about giving power to men. I mean, can a man consent to... What does it matter? Does a man consent to having his children stolen by a woman? So there's another aspect of feminism. We're talking about divorce. We're talking about divorce law. We're talking about the ability of women to divorce men and take the children. There's all these things adding up, and now we're finally getting to this transgender aspect. And there are some TERFs. There are these feminists who will say things like transgender people are not real women. But they're not really in the mainstream right now. The mainstream is this transgender acceptance movement. So, again, you've seen this huge progression historically, going back hundreds of years, from first, the nature of women in the church changes radically. I can't stress that important enough, how radical that transformation is, and how no one would say today, oh, we have to start castrating men because we don't have any female singers in the church. I mean, it's just like a night and day change. But then there's a progression. That there's a boiling of the frog where we go from one extreme to the other, and in between things sort of make sense, or there's sort of this logical progression. From the church to cultural life, literature, female writers writing about the plight of women, the boredom of the stay-at-home mom life. And then we get to political feminism, right to vote. We get to prohibition, denying men's right to drugs. We get to whether that's good or not, another topic, but I'm just simply talking about a feminist movement. That's a key part of the feminist movement. You talk about then, we're moving on to the sexual revolution, so both at the same time, be as slutty as possible, but also condemn men as evil. So try to have sex with men, but also condemn them as evil. There's this very weird, I mean, some people would say it's like daddy issues, is kind of a popular phrase that's thrown around, but the idea of like hating men, Ryan Falk has talked about this in terms of feminism being an ideology which hates beta males. So when we talk about, when a feminism says, I hate men who are racist, I hate men who are sexist, I hate men who disrespect women, those are basic like feminist talking points. but then they will find an alpha who doesn't follow those rules, and they still seek him out for sex. That contradiction there is basically women are saying something on the surface. And women do this all the time, the doublespeak. Well, they'll say on the surface, like, oh, you know, if you want to go out with your friends, that's fine. I don't really care. But on this inside, they're saying, if you go out with your friends, I hate you, you're evil, you're a terrible person, you've abandoned me. So there's this doublespeak going on. When a woman says, I hate men who disrespect women, and what they're really saying is, I hate beta males. And I want an alpha male who's so strong that he can break these rules, and I'm still going to be attracted to him. But feminism, again, it's a hatred of beta males, and it's taking 90% of men of society, casting them out as inferior, and then the 10% of like superstar rappers or basketball players or football players or whatever, they can disrespect women, and that's fine because they're an alpha. And women are not logical enough to even understand the contradiction going on here. They're just mouthing things that emotionally feel true to them. It feels true to hate on beta males, and they frame that in the language of, I hate men who disrespect women. And it feels true to them to love alpha males, so they come up with some kind of justification for that of like, hey, I'm just liberated, I can do whatever I want with my sexuality. There's an interesting, probably a number of Asian feminists, like Asian female feminists who will say, I hate white men, I hate the patriarchy, and they only date white men. So this contradiction here, basically what they're saying is, it's a shit test. They're saying, I hate men, and that's code word for, you have to be really, really alpha to get with me. A woman who is not a feminist is going to be someone, or who doesn't talk in that language, who doesn't talk about that, doesn't hate men. Who is that? That's like a Christian woman. And what is Christianity? Christianity's relationship with women is to encourage women to have a marriage with a beta male. Beta male being here a provider, a stable man, someone who won't cheat on her, someone who's not an alpha male, someone who's just going to kind of be there and they're going to have like a quiet life. And you know these women who are very Christian, and they married men who are diminutive, who are weak, who are wishy-washy, but they love them because of this Christian ideology. So interesting stuff going on here. And now we have the transgender. Now we have all these things going on. Contradictory elements. But where can it go next? Where can it go next? I don't really know. I mean, they talk about the pay gap. Women are already a majority of college students. So women are making more money than men in actuality. Like, women who decide not to get pregnant ever in their lifetime make more money than men, basically. Now, the CEO thing is always going to be the case. Like, you're never going to get as many female CEOs as male CEOs. If you do have at that point, that's going to be an honorary title of CEO, and the board of directors or whoever is going to appoint some kind of like vice CEO to run things behind the scenes, and the woman will be a figurehead. You're never going to have a situation where women are actually running the show, because again, the female psychology is so, I would say, capitalist in its nature, but you could say consumptive, that it's not capable of organizing and producing and creating things to the same extent. We talk about bell curves here. Talk about a bell curve of male behavior, a bell curve of female behavior. Now, men who are attracted to men, we could argue that that is somehow ontologically narcissistic. You're attracted to the same form that you yourself strive to be. And so there's a feminine narcissistic element to that. And so, of course, we could say within the male gender, there are men who act like women. Gay men, they have this gay lisp. They talk like women. They have female mannerisms. And then we can look at different kinds of men. We can say, well, there's a spectrum of how feminine a man is to how masculine he is. There's a bell curve. Now, there is also a female bell curve, where some women are like, whether it's an actual diagnosis of autism or it's a sort of a joking diagnosis, but there are women who are autistic, and there are women who are extremely feminine, there are women who are prostitutes, there are all kinds of women with all kinds of psychologies. So that's a bell curve. When we talk about the extremes of a bell curve, and this is interesting, like with the coughness debate between him and Kevin McDonald, and he says, well, you know, look at this, and you can look at the statistics. He says, like, look, if Jews have an IQ of 112 on average, then if you look at the IQs of people with an IQ of over, I think it's 145, there are going to be roughly 5,000 Jews in America with an IQ over 145, and 5,000 non-Jews, or just white people, with an IQ over 145. And so the idea that Jews should be overrepresented by 45% in terms of, the top millionaires or billionaires or something is not unreasonable. In fact, they would be underrepresented according to that. Of course, IQ is not everything. It's just one factor of our personality. There are many smart people, high IQs, who have terrible lives because they can't get themselves together. They don't have self-control. But in any case, you take that and you look at women and men. And there's a very similar thing going on. I wonder what Kaufness would have to say about feminism and the question of CEOs. That, yes, women can compete with men in terms of middle-class jobs. But when you start to get up to the CEOs, there's such an extreme narrowing. And again, it's not about intelligence quotient, but there's a whole number of personality factors that go into making a person a CEO. So having a tall body, being tall, being over 6 foot is a huge part of being a CEO. It affects how people perceive you. It affects your ability to lead people. So there's height, there's physical stature, there's strength, there's IQ, there's extroversion, there's willpower. So there's many different factors that men possess on the extreme, on this upper end of the bell curve, that allow them to outcompete women every single time. And there's really no women on that side of the bell curve, and those who do get there as tokens, get there as figureheads and whatnot and so forth. So women can always compete in the middle. Women are going to beat men in the college sphere. They're better test takers. They're better in the middle. At the extremes, men are still going to win. So what do you do with that? What's the future? I think it's a lot of lying. I think it's a lot of hypocrisy. I think it's a lot of... you even look at Sweden, the most progressive country ever, and still something like 80% of the engineers are male. So you just can't, at some point when we're talking about the upper end of the bell curve, extreme behaviors, extreme masculinity, women can't compete. In the same way, women will never compete in male sports. And men who pretend to be women and call themselves transgender and they compete in female sports, they will dominate. Even though they're this very small, you could have one transgender guy in a field of 100 female sprinters and he's going to win because he's biologically male. There's such an advantage there. Now, all those female athletes, they're going to be better sprinters than the average man. So women can beat men up to a point. When you get to the fastest person on earth, or the fastest person in the country, or the best CEO in the country, or whatever, women are going to lose every time because that's how bell curves work. And Nathan Kaufness has demonstrated this, supposedly supporting a mainstream position, which is very interesting. I think we should reference that as much as possible. In any case, you're just going to see a lot of lies and deception used to further feminism, and the same thing's going to happen with transgenderism. And it's just, to me, it is a consumptive aspect of capitalism. This is late-stage capitalism. Of course, I don't follow like some kind of traditional Marxist ideology that what's coming next is some beautiful socialism, and then we're going to have a utopian communism. But what I'm saying essentially is that we've run out of things to consume. There's such an abundance of resources that we don't know how to continue the consumptive urge of capitalism. We don't know where to go next. And so things like feminism, things like transgenderism have to be invented. And now we're moving from a production economy, we're moving from an industrial economy, we're moving from an economy, even a technological economy where we actually produce things. We're moving on to an economy, a service economy, where we service people's emotions, we service people's fantasies. And one way we do that is we service the feminist industry, which is an industry, and the consumers of that industry are the majority of women in America. Women in America consume the ideology of feminism, and the capitalist system, the economy, is servicing them full-time, giving them positions, giving them jobs, giving them things to make them pretend that everything's all right. You have the Tinder, you have the dating industry to fuel them, to give them the alpha males to satisfy them sexually, while at the same time they can just pretend to hate men and hate masculine traits, while at the same time sleeping with Chad. So there's an entire industry, billions and billions of dollars set up around keeping this system going, which is a self-consumptive industry. It's a Keynesian industry. It is a broken window industry. It is not meant to produce anything of worth. It's actually meant to destroy, destroy, destroy. And we are feeding this black hole. We're dumping resources into this black hole and not really getting anything out of it, except we're increasing our capacity for lying. We're increasing the capacity for deception. We're increasing the capacity for new and more perverse forms of societal norms, and seeing how far we can push human psychology. How far can we push it before it breaks? Or the idea is ultimately, can we push it? Can we make this system so big and so complex and so efficient at fueling consumption, which is what the system is driven towards, is how can we increase consumption so that we can increase our ability to fuel consumption, and then ultimately become so good at that we can make some kind of artificial intelligence or something like that. And then we'll be at a point psychologically where people are so confused, people are so mixed up, that they'll finally be willing to accept their own extinction at the hands of artificial intelligence. I mean, because that's the direction we're going in. A lot of people already accept that. So, the individual, I think, has to look at this huge spectrum. And again, I'm not here, I cannot prescribe who you are. A leftist could watch my video, and I really wish they would. They won't, but I wish they would. And that's kind of why I like the idea of moderating the message, simply because I do want to engage with leftists in a metaphysical way. Like, I want them to engage with deep questions about human psychology that we don't need to get into the nitty-gritty of the political. And I want to be able to say, like, look, Marxists, like, or leftists in general, like, your analysis of history is correct. Yeah, feminism does have this long, storied tradition in Western civilization. Yeah, feminism is part of who we are. Is that a good thing? Have we been ascending? What does it mean to ascend? Well, are you ascribing to a capitalistic definition of progress? So you're a capitalist then. So you're a neoliberal. So, is that an authentic leftist tradition? So to ask those questions, I'd really like to have that kind of debate, because people on the right, I find, are so stuck in their own thinking, and they're so stuck in their echo chamber, they don't want to listen to anyone else. And so you have the right, the way I view it, is this little core of people who are traditionally minded, conservative minded. They don't want to change. They have their prescriptions for reality. They want to, wipe out everyone who isn't like them. They want an ethno-state. They want a homogeneous society. They want to think as they think and not change their mind. People on the left traditionally have been more open to that, although now people point out that the left is more and more totalitarian, more and more close-minded than ever before, less and less tolerant. So the left is less and less willing. But still, leftists on a whole, from my perspective, still form the vast majority of people. I mean, when we're talking about questions of race and sexuality, like, is it okay to be racist? Is it okay to be sexist? You ask these sort of questions, the vast majority of people are still going to say, no, we're with the party line, we're with the mainstream left-wing party line. And so if that's kind of the big chunk of society, and the vast number of smart people are contained within that, and then you have a smaller conservative right-wing core, and there's also smart people in that as well. But there's still a number of people to be reached out there, a number of people to engage with, to ask, are all of your principles, all the things that you like, is that consistent? Do you have a consistent worldview? Does everything work together? Because the question for myself and for other people that I think we need to ask ourselves daily, and to examine moment by moment, and then also on a grand historical scale, is, are we living in harmony with our principles, and are our principles in harmony with one another? And I say time and time again that the human mind, the way it's biologically structured, is not even necessarily a harmonious system. And so it makes sense to me that consciousness, human consciousness, would be accompanied by a set of rules known as religion, because we don't actually have inbuilt biological instinctive rules to govern the relationship between the conscious mind and the unconscious mind. That's why you have something like shamanism or something like religion, because it allows for a framework of communication between the conscious mind and the subconscious. And Jung talks about this, and lots of perennialists talk about this. Joseph Campbell talks about this. So that interaction, there has to be some kind of mimetic or ideological or ritualistic system to harmonize two disharmonious things. So my question is, how do we harmonize our lives? How do we harmonize the world? The question to you is, are you harmonious? Are you in harmony with yourself? Examine your life, examine your ideology. So I put that challenge to leftists. I mean, I can try to challenge rightists, but they'll say, no, I just want, like, a white ethno-state, a patriarchy, and everything's homogeneous and no one will disagree. It's like, okay, dude. All right, like, I can't necessarily change people's prescriptions. I can argue with people till the sun goes down, and we can argue the facts, and we can argue the data, and we can argue empirically. But still, even if I point out and I say, like, look, we have all this evidence that there are these differences between populations, people will still say, but they should be the same. Even if they are very different, they should be the same. This is what Christians, early abolitionists in Canada and so on, were saying back in the 1800s, 1700s, even as early as the 1600s. They might say, okay, yes, these populations might be different in actuality, descriptively, but prescriptively, they should be the same. They should all be the same before God, and so we should strive to civilize these people, and we should strive to help them be altruistic and to feed their consumption, to dump resources upon them until they become like us. And, you know, that has been essentially giving the fish to the man and never teaching the man how to fish, unfortunately. So, you know, I would want to challenge people on this, and I think this is the right thing to do. That's about all for now. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.